Hello and a very warm welcome to everybody. Today, this is a series where we are going to be having an interview with a keynote speaker. He is a veteran when it comes to blockchain technology. This is Jason Fernandes that we're talking about. Jason is the Chief Business Officer at NFT Tech. And when we look at Jason's credentials, we'll of course be getting more insights into the emerging trends of blockchain technology via Jason's entire career in the same field. He speaks regularly on blockchain, cryptocurrency. He wants us all, especially to get more knowledge about all these areas and domains. He's an entrepreneur. He is a blockchain speaker. He is a crypto analyst. So all the details are going to be given over here. He knows about the emerging trends as well as majorly tries to spread that information to make sure that all of us are more aware, having a well-rounded understanding of these new emerging trends. And even as a teenager, 24 years ago, Jason started by founding zeocities.com. So having that incredible handover entrepreneurship, as well as knowing all the details, he also wrote for Chip magazines. Welcome, Jason. Thanks a ton for agreeing to make sure that you're coming and just sharing your experiences with us. Really very insightful to have you over here. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Jason, we'd like to begin. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Could you just please help us with a little detail about yourself? Of course, like we know via your LinkedIn profile, but something coming from you, it'll be very insightful.
Sure. So I consider myself mostly a technologist. I think that's sort of the lens through which I view the world, and pretty much have been in this space since I was about 13 or 14 when I started like my first company then. And I think I've always been fascinated by technology and trying to be sort of at the cutting edge of what exists really. So back in when I first started, that was the internet, and I remember I often tell people that when I started getting onto the internet, like it was in black and white. That was because we had shell accounts. You had to actually dial in, and it would be a black screen. So but it was great to be kind of on the cutting edge. And seeing kind of how the internet was developing, how the dot-com bubble grew, then burst, and sort of getting that context, I think that's really helped understand for me, or explain to me at least, kind of how things develop over time with, particularly in blockchain and pretty much any emerging technology. It follows a very, very similar trajectory. And so those are the sort of things that I find really fascinating.
Great. Also, I think, of course, it was really informative knowing that, you founded the first organization as a teenager, and we were all fascinated by it. That was 24 years ago. You also started this entire interest in blockchain, cryptocurrency while you were writing. That was also really fascinating. And what we saw over your LinkedIn profile, you've got this sheer diversity of profile experience, right? You started off as a writer. You went on to become an entrepreneur. You were an entrepreneur rather before when we look at GeoCities back in the day. And at the moment also, we're able to see that, when it comes to blockchain consulting and investments, you've always been at the forefront. So very diverse portfolio then. Of course, you are telling us that, there's been a sea change in technology ever since you started. Could you please help us understand that what was essentially the problem statement? How did this entire trajectory transform itself? How were things back then? Of course, you shared it briefly, but a little more in greater detail. How were things previously and how have they transformed over a period of time?
Sure, that's a great question. I actually started off kind of as a writer for Chip magazine. That's sort of one of the main things I did outside of whatever I was working on internally. And at the time, Chip was India's largest selling computer magazine. And how that came about was I'd written a software program called the UFO Story, and determined sort of the best way to get wide distribution for that program was to get on the free CD that came with the magazine, right? So at the time, there was only PC Quest and Chip magazine, and both came with this free CD. And most people in India really got their software from that CD because the internet really hadn't really taken off. So I just took a rickshaw to the Chip magazine offices and was able to walk right in and talk to the person that made the decision to put stuff on the CD. And they did. And the next month, I launched another program called Cheetah's Heaven, also on Chip magazine CD. And finally, they contacted me and they were like, hey, would you like to come on board as a game reviewer and also to work on the advisor column, which is something like a troubleshooting column. So that's kind of how that got started. You mentioned GeoCities. That was one of my first companies. And that came about sort of as a means to fund a nonprofit that I had founded called LD Kids. So ZeoCities was a portal, now known as a horizontal portal, had its own email service, search engine, e-commerce store. And later I ended up winning sponsorship from the UK communications giant Cable and Wireless after a chance encounter with their CEO in Barbados. And so they ended up funding LD Kids. And so that's kind of how I got into this whole thing. It's sort of almost by accident.
Incredible. You've done stellar work when you were back in the University of Texas in Austin. You went over there for your higher studies. How was it like studying outside India back then? What do you think has transformed, particularly in terms of technology? And I remember the last conversation, the masterclass that I'd attended of yours, you also at that time were telling us that how your organization also set base in Canada. So help us understand that, what are these differences in the use of technology, or otherwise, what are the changes that you're able to see across, and how was your experience studying abroad?
It's a good question. I mean, one of the contrasts with education in the United States versus education in India, and I saw this while I was at the American school, which is where I graduated high school, is that students are given a fair amount of autonomy in discovering the things that they're interested in. So really, for example, at UT, I started off as a computer science major, but I got to college like just before 9/11. And that deeply influenced sort of how I looked at the world and decided to start paying attention to geopolitics. And a few people know this, but I actually graduated college with a political science degree. So it's not actually in technology or anything like that. But of course, once I was out, I moved back into technology. But I guess in terms of from a technology perspective, so one of the things is when I moved to the American Consulate School in Bombay, I was able to sort of use a laptop. And that made a huge difference in terms of, because I being dyslexic and dysgraphic and things like that, writing and reading was a huge challenge, and it was sort of standing in the way of being able to just access information. And so having a laptop and being able to use it in school was something that was really helpful to me. And of course, moving into college, it was much the same thing in terms of, at least at UT Austin, you can pretty much take your laptop to class and just work on it while the professor is talking. But again, it comes down to like being self-motivated and knowing, because you can just get on your laptop and get on Google or something. So you have to really be self-motivated. And that's kind of one of the differences between the United States and India when it comes to education.
Wow, I think that was absolutely insightful when you said autonomy to develop yourself, and how you actually graduated with the political science majors. I was not aware about it, and your sheer curiosity in the arena of technology took you there. That's, I think, a major key takeaway there. Thanks for sharing that. You also founded the legal DVR on the internet, Record TV. Correct me if I'm going wrong. What was the genesis of that particular idea, and how did you identify this was a problem worth solving back then?
Sure. So Record TV, I co-founded with my brother and Varsha Jagdali, who is now his wife. And it was the first legal web-based DVR in the world. So at the time, television was changing. There was really two ways it could have gone. One, of course, was sort of video on demand. The other was DVR. So at the time, TiVo, I don't know if you're aware of TiVo, but TiVo was really big. And TiVo was sort of focused on the digital video recorder sort of DVR path, essentially. And so we made the calculation that the industry would evolve in favor of the DVR. So I often joke that Record TV was streaming TV shows when Netflix was still mailing DVDs out, to people in little paper envelopes. Eventually, sort of the world moved away from the DVR model and more into the video on demand model, because that proved to be more successful. But however, as a company, when Record TV began, nobody was yet streaming TV shows on the internet. And that was an area where RTV really innovated, basically.
Jason, you've not really shied away from giving back to the society. One such initiative that you've been associated with, you've been the founder of LD Kids, that is Learning Disabled Kids Support India. And you also mentioned about the fact that, you also had certain issues therein when you were growing up. So tell us a little about your contribution to giving it to the society, which I was really intrigued when the very first time I was introducing your masterclass then. And, one such initiative, like I said, was LD Kids that you actually had been a part of. So how did that all started? What was the idea behind? What prompted you to definitely give it back to the society as well? What triggered that?
Sure. Well, I touched on this a bit when I spoke about ZOCs and Cable and Wireless. So LD Kids was a nonprofit focused on destigmatizing learning disabilities. And I struggled with learning disabilities myself. So I had dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, hyperactivity. So in terms of learning disabilities, I pretty much hit the jackpot, right? So I was diagnosed around 98. and almost nobody had heard of learning disabilities in India back then. Like, and my failures in education were sort of chalked up to lack of interest or aptitude. And so to give this put this in context, the year I was diagnosed in 98, there was only one government recognized testing center, and that was at Sion Hospital. And an average, and they were doing an average of about 18 people that were being diagnosed with dyslexia on a yearly basis. And the next year, after I found LD Kids and the massive publicity it received, so it was on the Times of India, Indian Express, it was on BBC LA Times. After that, people started to really hear about and really understand LD Kids and just like the learning disabilities existed. And I think the year after that, they diagnosed some 300 people with learning disabilities. And then after that, it kept increasing. And so you can just imagine a country of, in a city of like 20 million people, there was originally only 18 people being diagnosed. And then now it's massively increased. So I think if you just think about sort of, at least for me, being diagnosed was really, really helpful because it put things in context. So I was able to understand that I wasn't stupid, which really helped in terms of, because you even as a person, you're not really sure what exactly is going on if you can't, if you have issues in some areas and you don't have issues in others. So it was really liberating to be diagnosed. And so I hope that now extends to several other people that are diagnosed and now pretty much take corrective measures and work around that as opposed to, beating themselves against a brick wall.
I think that was really a touching answer and apt that, a lot of times we just are brushed together that we're lacking interest altogether, whereas that's not the case at all. And people are usually oblivious still, but I think this entire initiative of LD Kids really helped in the right direction. I know you've answered this question, but I'm still getting very intrigued because, when we look at the sheer mammoth of, legacy that you've built in the Internet of Things space or the blockchain technology space, you've also founded multiple startups. They're coming to your altogether. So when you're looking at your entire legacy that you've actually founded over here, what was the first motivation that got you landed towards the blockchain space? Of course, you spoke about your writing stint, but what was there some other trigger as well that prompted you or that nudged you to get towards the blockchain space? And what really excites you to still continue in this particular space despite the fact that there are so many governmental regulations every now and then, or sometimes people are talking about I see a smile on your face in that particular question. So what really prompted you and what still makes you continue being excited about the field of blockchain?
Sure. So there actually was a catalyst. So I was working on a company called Smart Clock. And essentially that was in the IoT space. And around simultaneously, I was writing for a magazine called Globe Asia. I had a monthly column there, technology column. And so around 2013, I became obsessed with the idea of Bitcoin and decentralized money. And I wrote a series of articles in Globe Asia, but also in Man's World magazine, which is India's largest selling men's magazine, sort of about crypto. So I was already like heavily interested in crypto. Something I was like tracking really closely. And then sooner or later, I just sort of pivoted Smart Clock from a blockchain into basically a blockchain company, which I called Funnel. And very soon after that, I was offered a chance to co-found AE Token, which is another company I was part of. And that was alongside Gene Hoffman. So Gene is a legend in this space. Gene actually was the very first guy to ever sell music on the internet. He's currently president of Chia Networks, which is a very, very massive cryptocurrency. I think their market cap is somewhere around 20 billion. But yeah, so getting an opportunity to like work really closely with Gene and of course also met a lot of his friends. Marcus Siegel was an advisor at our company. So I really got to learn alongside some of these literally legendary people in the crypto space, in the technology space. And so really couldn't turn that down. So that's kind of how I ended up in blockchain.
That's really interesting. There's another question that I have for you. So when we look at the entire geopolitical space, some governments have embraced blockchain technology or the new technologies with open arms, but there have been countries which have been little apprehensive. And considering you are closely associated with being an advisor to the government also, or, the associations, the state governments, political parties on blockchain technology. So what is your take on the apprehensions that government usually has about the crypto space or adopting any new technology for that matter?
This is a great question. I mean, I think it's a really sad state of affairs. I think if you actually look at financial inclusion as sort of a goal that people that society should strive for, India happens to be one of the countries where financial inclusion is a distant dream, right? And that is also true for other countries in South Asia, right? So it's funny because if you look at the countries in South Asia that are really lacking in sort of financial inclusion, that are sort of outside this technological development world that we find ourselves in, a lot of these countries are in South Asia and also Africa. But when it comes to South Asia, pretty much every country, with the exception of India, has banned cryptocurrency. And India, of course, has taken less than positive view on it as well. So it's a really sad state because the people that really need this sort of technology are not actually benefiting. And it's actually going off to, people in the United States and developed countries who already have financial inclusion. So in terms of, is it fulfilling its promise? It's not. And it's not because, state governments, political parties, well, let's say, national governments are extremely leery of the technology. So I think, generally speaking, Singapore has taken a very good approach. And I think, you should have some sort of sandbox where, people are able, like technologists are sort of able to experiment and try different things without having to worry about, going to jail. So I mean, I know the guy who founded Unicoin, they set up if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Unicoin, but they set up a Bitcoin ATM and the CEO found himself in jail for a couple of weeks. So, I mean, that's shocking, right? Like that, and that has a chilling effect on entrepreneurship in the blockchain space in India. And actually, that's one of the reasons why you find a large amount of entrepreneurs in this space are actually moving to countries like Dubai, because they find the regulation there, they're more friendly and sort of less stressful. I mean, I headed XRX Exchange in India for a while, for about a year, and it was just a complete. It's just an enormous amount of stress, because every couple of months there would be something extremely negative about blockchain in the news, and they would say, "Hey, we're going to shut this down." And so, as like running a company, an exchange or something in India, where you're constantly worrying about whether the company can even endure for reasons completely outside of your control. I mean, it's extremely stressful. So, and I think that's kind of why I chose to work at companies overseas. So right now, because of my work at NFT Technologies, IBC, etc., none of this has anything to do with India, right? And so I'm able to do that without having to stress about whether my entire everything I'm worked for can be taken off in one fell swoop. So that's something that it's a real sad state of affairs. But I hope it gets better.
We hope so too. There was something about financial inclusion that you were talking about, of course, when you're also advising the state governments. You have your entire efforts have been validated when we are looking at the United Nations Karmaveer Chakra award, because you were promoting social and financial inclusion through blockchain technology. Now, here there's a very sorry state of affairs when we talk about financial inclusion, particularly when we look at women's scenario as well. So what are your thoughts? What are your opinions about the aspect of financial inclusion, especially when we are looking at women across the country? What are your views about that?
So actually, it's over the past couple of years, it's actually gotten better. So I think there was a time when there was about 77% of women were estimated to own bank accounts in India. Right now, I think recently in 2019, a survey said something, it was more like 80.7% of women in rural areas, 81% in urban areas had deposit accounts in banks. But and part of the main reason is because of this sort of Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana thing that they pushed. And by the way, a little over half of these Jan Dhan account holders are actually women. But access to financial services itself is not the same as financial inclusion, right? It's also a question of how invested are they in the modern world that we find ourselves in? How are they able to sort of navigate that, right? And if you're not able to sort of like make investments, if you're not able to take part in sort of the modern financial life, then you're not in a situation where there is financial inclusion. So I think there's a long way to go. We've come a long way as well, but I think one of the main decision factors that's going to change that is probably like how quickly India takes a more positive view towards blockchain and cryptocurrency. I think that'll make a huge difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's also concern regarding a lot of advice coming that software developers should transition into blockchain technology, blockchain development when we're looking at the future altogether. But whenever we've seen technologies, we have seen that blockchain still is at the nascent level, despite it being there for 12 years. And we also see that almost every technology goes through the adoption curve, and still, despite being 12 years old, we're able to see that blockchain is in the early phase of acceptance. So, what would your take be? In your opinion, do you think that is it correct, or if it is correct, then why should software developers transition to blockchain development?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think pretty soon, almost all software development is going to end up being blockchain development, right? And India has always led the charge when it comes to software development. We've been, the center of the outsourcing world for generations now, right? And I think we've sort of started to rest on our laurels a bit. It's particularly when it comes to blockchain technology, right? Because of India's extremely hostile view towards blockchain, cryptocurrency, things like that. A lot of the developers, if you're a good blockchain developer, highly unlikely that you'll stay in India, right? And so what ends up happening is when it comes to blockchain development in particular, India starts lagging behind countries like Russia, Ukraine, China, etc. So for Ad Luna, which is a company I co-founded and invested in very early on, the entire product is actually built in Ukraine. And you might wonder, why would I build this in Ukraine when I have access to all these software developers in India? The fact is, I actually don't. There really aren't that many, and there really aren't that many that are worth their salt, compared to countries like Ukraine and China. And also it comes down to dedication. So interestingly, a couple months ago, the product was about to be ready, and Ukraine was obviously invaded. And I remember one of our developers actually told us, he was like, I'm going to work on this, but they're bombing us, so I'm going to go down to the basement and keep working. And I was just thinking, if that was in India, if there were bombs falling, the Indian developers would be like, hey, we're out for a little while, we're just going to take it easy. But these guys kept doing it. Like, they kept working in the middle of a war. And that's admirable. And that comes down from somebody really loving their work and really being dedicated to it. And I don't know whether, because there's just such a small group of people to choose from in India, I don't think you'll be able to easily find that here.
Great. I think, a question that is stemming from this particular question, because a large chunk of people who are our audience, they are very curious to make careers in the arena of blockchain. So what are the skills that you think are required, which need to be developed, which need to be honed if you want to enter the blockchain space? Especially, could you help us that how can people build the proof of work, so to say, in this particular arena to demonstrate those skills which are required in the blockchain space?
I think enthusiasm is super important, right? Like, this is something that people don't really think about a lot, because it's sort of it's more a personality skill than something that you learn. But people need to be self-motivated and teach themselves to go get information rather than waiting for it to come to them and just sort of be absorbed. There's so many resources, Masters Union being one of them, for blockchain cryptocurrency, that if you actually decide, hey, I want to learn this, you absolutely can. And when I got started in crypto, like, it was such a niche field that there were few people that in the state that I could even talk to, that I could sort of discuss back and forth about stuff and even understand whether I'm on the right path, right? Because a lot of development and innovation is sort of exchanging ideas with other people, your compatriots, and there were no compatriots at the time. Now things have changed, because there are people in blockchain, and people that get in do have the ability to seek out other people that are maybe farther along in their journey, and try to absorb a bit of that information, right? And that, I think, is a benefit that people should take care of. Once people jump in, obviously solidity is important for EVM compatible chains. Rust is also becoming really, really popular, particularly with the rise of Neo Protocol and Solana, both of which are sort of Rust based. In terms of proof of work is like a consensus mechanism, right? And I think, not sure it quite applies to somebody's body of let's say work on, let's say, GitHub or something like that, right? It doesn't quite correlate. However, it really comes down to, like I said, just sort of finding that fellowship with other people that are in your space, in your area, and then just sort of like spending, all the time that you possibly can, all your free time, basically trying to absorb the information.
Right, right. I think that really elaborates. And a question that I was really curious to ask you from the very beginning, you've worn a number of hats. It's all known to all of us. You've been a startup founder, and that too, you started this journey as a teenager itself. You've constantly been a hustler all throughout, and a very successful hustler at that. You've been an advisor, you've been a technocrat, a technologist as well, a writer, and I think I may just continue with the endless list over here. But now, as an instructor, as a mentor, here at Masters Union, especially you will be leading the Pro Blockchain Developer MasterCamp, and a lot of students are very curious to make their careers and enroll accordingly. So what made you decide to become a master and share your knowledge? What really triggered you? Because everything was going in a flow, but what really prompted you? What was the trigger to give it back?
So I think I've been an advocate for blockchain and cryptocurrency since before India even had its first exchange, right? So like I wrote a series of articles in June 2013. India's first exchange started in October 2013. And I think if you looked at one of the very first articles I wrote, it was from Man's World magazine. And I called Bitcoin sort of the future of money. And I think far from just being, the future of money, the technology that underpins it, blockchain, has just so many use cases. And so I think that it's technology that ultimately, everybody will end up adopting. And even from a cryptocurrency perspective, if I'm focusing on cryptocurrency, I think cryptocurrency can be sort of the force that democratizes, money for that matter, right? I mean, we've had thousands of years of capitalism where, the very small elite has sort of managed to control how money moves and who gets what, who gets certain opportunities. And I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrency democratizes that, right? It makes it open for anybody. I mean, the fact that you can buy basically an ASIC miner and just start making your own Bitcoin, I think it, and I think more importantly, it actually teaches people about what money really is as a medium of exchange. We have grown up in a society where we believe that these pieces of paper have value, and that's something that we don't really question, and it's because the government says it. So the whole idea, if you think about the word fiat actually is Greek, and it means basically means this is money because we said it's money. We said, like, it's because we said it. That's what fiat is, and that doesn't seem like the best way to go if you really think about it, right? I mean, on the other hand, I think Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, I think these things will really start shaping the future. So anything that I can do to sort of promote blockchain adoption, push the technology. I've been doing this for the last several years. I'm happy to be involved in anything that sort of moves that needle forward in any way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think this was really insightful. Before we wrap up this interview, any thoughts that you'd probably like to give, especially to people who are going to be watching this interview? Any last pieces of advice? Any last sense from your end?
Sure. So I would just say, I know a lot of the people that are going to be watching this are actually, part of Masters Union. So I think that is a massive resource for people to like jump into blockchain, to like learn kind of, what are the various different factors. Last time I did something on tokenomics, which I think is something that very, very, very few people truly understand. I'm come across a lot of investors that don't really understand tokenomics, and not because they just haven't really understood how value gets. So a lot of traditional investors, they believe that everything that's good for the company is good for their investment. But when you are investing in a token, it's a very, very, very specific thing, and the company might do well, but the token might do badly if there's not enough utility in that. And so I covered that a little bit in the previous masterclass I did, and I think that was. These are things that, the average person getting into crypto and blockchain just don't have access to. They just don't, it just doesn't exist. As far as I know, when I really tried to understand tokenomics, it really came from studying, hundreds and hundreds of companies' pitch decks and trying to understand how exactly value, got distributed. But now, it's as simple as somebody sort of, signing up for Masters Union and sort of paying attention. So that's a great start. I think this is where, people get into this, but ultimately they should spend, basically their entire free time. If they're really dedicated to jumping into this, like, they should spend sort of all their free time, just massively absorbing this information and just trying to understand. And by the way, it doesn't take that long. I think you can get, a fair idea of things like within a few months. Like it's like the 80-20 rule. You can probably pick up 80% of the knowledge within the first a few months, let's say. And then, it's just a question of honing those skills. So I think now is the time to get started, because everything is moving there anyway. So the sooner they get started, the better.
Absolutely. Well, I think besides the many takeaways that I had while interviewing you, one of the most important one, which is definitely going to be resonating all throughout, is the fact that you talked about the personality skill of enthusiasm, and you've displayed it today because you were under the weather, but I think immaculately helping us understand the arena of blockchain technology, understanding your portfolio entirely. And truly, I think it was absolutely inspiring once again to be discussing and talking about blockchain, about your career with you. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate that. And we look forward to hosting you for other masterclasses in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all having me, and we'll speak soon.